For today's seminar, I'd like to introduce Dr. Luke Madaus. Dr. Madaus received his PhD from the University of Washington in 2016, where he studied deep convective initiation. He did his postdoctoral fellowship at NCAR in Boulder. Dr. Madaus is an honorary UW AOS fellow, and he is currently a lead scientist for Climate Score Global at Jupiter, where he provides leadership on integrating climate information into the Jupiter Climate Score Intelligence platform. So please welcome Dr. Luke Madaus.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I'm Luke Madaus. I'm just starting now as an honorary fellow of this department. It's a unique opportunity. I want to take this talk to kind of introduce myself just to the people in the department and talk a little about what I do and what we do at Jupiter, or Jupiter Intelligence, which is the company I'm working for. Small startup, but focused on bringing climate change to customers who are climate change information to customers who are looking for that kind of information. Just want to elaborate a little bit on my background. I actually grew up in this area. I grew up in Roscoe, Illinois, so just south of the Illinois-Wisconsin border, but my family's all in southern Wisconsin, so I moved here a couple of years ago, and so it's coming back home to my family area. I did my undergrad at the University of Oklahoma, where I had an internship for 3 years with the Radar Operations Center and helped with the dual polarization rollout there. So kind of thought I'd be getting into radar meteorology and that would be my thing. Then I did a project during my senior year of undergrad running the WARF model to do some simulations of convective events and decided, maybe I want to do numerical weather prediction. And ended up going to grad school to do that along with data simulation. So I was at University of Washington for my thesis work there. Was a graduate visiting program student at NCAR throughout my graduate career, and those connections led to me getting an ASP postdoc at NCAR, which I had for a grand total of 7 months, which was apparently not the shortest ASP postdoc, but fairly close to that. It just so happened that one day, 7 months or so into my postdoc, I was in a meeting with Josh Hacker, who was the head of the Research Applications Lab at the time. And he announced he was leaving NCAR to go and do this startup called Jupiter to look at weather and climate risk management. And I jokingly asked him at the time if he was hiring, and he got very serious. He was like, yes, we should talk next Tuesday. And so I showed up on Tuesday, and he gave me the whole pitch, and it sounded interesting to me, and I wasn't exactly happy with where my postdoc was going, so decided to sign up. So within the course of a week, my career took a hard turn, and I was the first non-founder employee of Jupiter way back in the day. And now I'm starting this honorary fellowship with University of Wisconsin, and hopefully that will lead to some more opportunities going forward for all of us. So like I said, this is not going to be a science-heavy talk. I want to give you more background about what is Jupiter, what are we doing at Jupiter, what kind of products do we generate based on responses we're getting from our customers, what they are looking for. Talk about some ongoing research questions that we've got, maybe sparking some interest from some people in this room or listening online for some possible collaboration opportunities, which I'll wrap up with some thoughts on that at the end. So first, what is Jupiter? So this is the slide that our product team presents to people when they say, I want to give Jupiter in a nutshell. I'll try to summarize this here, but go into a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. So we've got a number of customers across a variety of different sectors of commerce, all with unique needs in terms of what they're looking for from climate science and climate change information. We kind of summarize that in terms of a number of perils that they tend to ask about. So flood, fire, heat, drought, wind, and hail. And what we do is we build products that talk about how the risks of these perils are changing with time on basically 2 different spatial scales. We have a global product, or a global analysis that we provide to customers kind of on an as-needed basis, but then also regional or location-specific analyses that we do when customers come to us with very specific requests about very specific areas or very specific metrics they're interested in. So who are these customers? This is, as of last week, they updated this slide. Right now, it's mainly 4 big sectors or groups. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these groups and the kinds of things that they're looking for, asking for. So one is industrial infrastructure, and that's a lot of energy companies or utilities companies. One of the common questions we get asked is about transmission lines, particularly this last year with that incident in Texas with the extreme cold temperatures, and they had all sorts of icing concerns and lines going down. we're surprisingly enough in a global warming environment this year getting a ton of questions about how will our risk of ice storms and icing change in the future. So that's, we get questions like that, a lot of questions about wind, not only for wind energy applications, but also for extreme winds that can disrupt transmission lines, and this also feeds into fire as well. So that's industrial infrastructure. We've got financial services as another one. This is banks, mortgage lenders, places where people have invested money into specific properties or assets, and they're curious how the value of that might be affected in the future due to climate change. This group is interesting because so much of it revolves around the 30-year mortgage. So we have a lot of customers who are really concerned about climate change over the next 30 years, and that's about it. They want to know, I've got this new mortgage, what's the likelihood with the changing climate over the next 30 years that it's going to be flooded, we're going to lose our investment in that property. That also presents a challenge, because for a lot of these different perils, the actual climate change signal over the next 30 years is somewhat hard to distinguish outside of the internal natural variability. So this sector, we actually have to do a lot of education and communication with them to really say what we can and cannot say at the current state of the science about how these risks will be changing. We've got a number of customers in the public sector, mainly city and county level governments who are interested in analyses, more of those localized kind of location-specific analyses, that class of products. A lot of interest in flooding there. We also do some work with housing and urban development, Department of Defense, and other regulatory agencies. And then finally, they call this sector distribution, but the bulk of it I think of as consulting firms. These are companies who basically provide services to other companies talking about holistic looks at risk. So not just risk from climate, but risks from the economy or wars or social unrest, things like that. And we can provide a climate component to those risks and give them that climate information. So that's the kind of customers we talk with. This is how we're organized right now. I don't want to bore everyone too much with an org chart, but I do want to make one point about how Jupiter is structured, and that's we have 60 total employees right now. Half of them are on the science team. So up until this point, actually, the majority of the employees at Jupiter have been scientists. And as a result, the culture of the company has evolved in concert with how our science team has evolved its culture, which makes it a really fun place to work as a scientist. I don't feel like I'm working in a business sometimes so much as I'm working with just a group of other scientists kind of at a research lab working on problems. Our science team itself, we have 4 broad groups that we are now kind of dividing into as we've grown. We've got a data science team. This is a lot of people who do applied statistics, machine learning, those sorts of techniques. A scientific software development team, which is kind of uniquely separate from our software engineering team. Software engineering team mainly focuses on building the website and the API our customers use to access our data. The scientific software development team is the people who help us when I have questions like, I want to do 2,000 WRF simulations of extreme events. How do I run this at scale on the cloud? They help us put together those kinds of solutions and make my code better and all these other great things that I don't have to worry about as much. We've also got 2 modeling groups. A hydro modeling group. This is mainly because I'd say probably 3/4 of our customer requests are about flooding. That is by far our #1 peril that people talk about. So we have a whole team of coastal ocean modelers who look at storm surge modeling, overland pluvial flood modelers who do local flood modeling down to really excruciatingly high resolutions that, as a weather modeler, I can't even fathom trying to model at that resolution. And then also hydrologists looking at water moving through the Earth system. And then a weather and climate modeling team. As this team is growing, I'm actually moving to the leadership of that team within the next couple of weeks, and we are actively hiring for that team. This is a lot of dynamical downscaling that group does. The WRF model is kind of our workhorse model, but we have a whole library of other models of varying complexity and orders that we use to look at specific problems or specific perils in our product development. So being a scientist at Jupiter, I want to highlight 3 areas of what makes it fun for me to work at Jupiter. So starting on the lower right, the team of people we get to work with is great. Of those 30 people on our team right now, I think only 3 or 4 of them had any background in the private sector before joining Jupiter. Everyone else came from academia in some capacity, either coming out of grad school, coming from a national lab like NCAR or one of the NOAA facilities. And so as a result, the culture of our team, as I alluded to before, has really felt like working on a science group. We have weekly paper discussions where we go through what are the latest papers in machine learning literature as it relates to weather and climate, and have those sorts of discussions. There's a lot of peer review that goes on, reviewing code, reviewing our science, reviewing our results. It's a lot of these themes of things that we took from academia and have kind of ingrained in our culture. So that's really fun. You get to work with a lot of end users interested in climate risk in a lot of different ways. So this is the thing where I never feel like I'm bored with the project I'm working on because 2 weeks later another question is going to get asked to me of a completely different subject, and I get to think about that instead. There's a lot of questions where customers will come to us and ask about things that we just cannot do. The current state of the science is such that we cannot answer the kinds of questions they're asking with the kinds of confidence that they are looking for. So it's this ongoing struggle of trying to figure out what we can and cannot say with confidence about a number of these different perils as the science is evolving. It's a lot faster paced, and that is not for everyone, but I really enjoy it. That kind of context switching and being able to work on a lot of things at once, I find really fun. This last point at the top here is more the nerdy side of me. We are a cloud native company, which means that outside of our laptops, that's the only computers we own. All of our modeling, all of our analysis, all of our data storage happens on the cloud. We use Amazon Web Services as our primary provider. And that's been just a fun experience in and of itself, because I've had to take all of these things that I learned to do on Cheyenne on the supercomputer or doing Jupiter notebooks on my laptop and transition that to working in a cloud-based environment. But once you get the hang of it, there's a lot you can do on the cloud. There's a lot of scaling you can do with resources. I don't have to worry about, I ran out of memory for this process, what am I going to do? I can just fire up a larger instance, and as long as I justify that cost, then I can go and complete my analysis without having to find some other solution or work around this. So taking advantage, using that whole sphere of technology has been really fun in context computing. All right, so with all this fun and discussion and product and science stuff, what do we actually make? What are our products? So one of the challenges with our product is we have to accommodate a wide variety of users across a whole spectrum of experiences and understanding of what climate science is. I'd say a lot of our customers come in actually with very little expertise or understanding of what climate science is at all. We literally have customers who come to us and just say, our shareholders are telling us we have to be concerned about this. What should we be concerned about? And then it's a long education process for us of trying to figure out with them, where is your business model exposed to these different aspects of climate? What are some indirect ways climate might be impacting you? And furthermore, is there any information we can provide that might actually be able to help them? On the other side of the spectrum, there are some companies that have weather and climate scientists on staff, and they will tend to ask us very specific questions to match very specific regulatory requirements. And you'll go into these meetings and they'll poke at you about, why are you using this climate model and not this climate model? Or why did you use a GEV instead of a Gumbel for your extreme value analysis? Or all sorts of specific questions. So we have to design products that can satisfy both these sets of people. They have to be digestible and understandable enough such that people who don't have a lot of experience in this can still make use of the data, while also being rigorous enough and documented well enough such that people who have these exacting requirements can actually answer their questions and be satisfied that what we're doing will work for them. Across the board, though, what we found is that customers want to see peer-reviewed data and methods. And this is probably our main source of credibility in our analyses that we do. So when we go and start our process of doing an analysis for a customer or building a product, we start from publicly available, community-acknowledged, peer-reviewed, cited data sets and models. We're not running our own global climate models at Jupiter. We don't see a need to. There's so many other groups doing that who are doing a much better job of it than our little team could do. Plus, these models are all well vetted. There's tons of literature about them describing how good they are, what they're good at, what they're bad at. Just trying to build up that same level of confidence and documentation for something we would do ourselves doesn't make sense. And our customers appreciate that we can say, hey, we're using the same set of models that went into the IPCC reports or something that's known like that. When we do have to build things internally, again, we rely on methods that have been developed within the academic community. I don't think there's any model we've developed that didn't start with, well, here is at least 3 or 4 different people who've already tried this. They've published papers on it. We have a place to start. we can defend that this seems to be a legitimate way of answering this kind of problem. So we don't want to have black boxes. We want to have models and methods that are out there, understandable, and people can relate to from different points of view. And finally, we do submit ourselves to external validation quite frequently. So we will ask independent groups from academic communities, we'll ask local engineers for doing a flood model to look at our results and say, do they make sense? Do our methods match up with your expectations for something that is a legitimate thing to do? So we try to do what we can to reassure our customers that what they are seeing is basically the best we can be doing with the science, data, and methods available to us. So putting it all together, this is a schematic diagram in some ways of how we have built our product. So it starts at the bottom, at the core of these analyses, is with underlying data sets. Like I said, we draw from publicly available data sets. We use CMIP5 and CMIP6 as our main global climate projections. We've also brought in other downscaled data sets that people have produced and are known in the community. We calibrate those data against in situ observations, radar, satellite products to help get more localized estimates of the climate and how it might change. And then there are other data sets we bring in for predictors like elevation or land surface characteristics that can help us further refine those local climate projections. Taking that data, we have a number of different modeling infrastructures ranging from simple statistical models all the way to full-blown dynamical downscaling models. And there is some machine learning in there as well. And the result of it is basically two broad categories of products that I kind of alluded to at the beginning. One are these portfolio level aggregation or global scale products. And this, primarily what it is just a big statistical downscaling experiment where for all those perils that I listed before, we've picked a handful of metrics, we've done a statistical downscaling exercise using these global climate models kind of as the starting point, and we get these global projections of specific metrics that our customers can look at. The other class of products is, again, those localized asset level drill downs where it's more leaning on the dynamical downscaling capabilities that we have to really look at the specifics of a certain area, the meteorology, the local geography, to get much more specific estimates of how the climate might change. And this is all done on the cloud with cloud storage and modeling. Here are those two classes of products kind of broken out. We call them internally Climate Score Global. That's that global statistical downscaling sort of approach. And then Climate Score Planning, which is more the dynamical downscaling approach. So in each of these products, we'll produce multiple climate scenarios. We currently are using the RCP or SSP type scenarios, but more and more regulators are looking or asking for things like a 2 Celsius warmer climate, or there are even specific sectors of the economy, say in the energy sector, where they've defined their own scenarios of future possible change. And that actually is an ongoing challenge for us is, all these climate models that we have, the majority of them have been written to use these sorts of scenarios. How do we take that information and translate it into these very specific industry unique requirements for future scenarios? We produce estimates of the climate that update every 5 years. So for some of these it's a very slow evolving distribution, but we do produce that kind of temporal resolution. And then the spatial scale of these is really driven by our flood models. So our global flood model goes down to 90 meters globally. Our local flood models can get down to 1 to 3 meters in urban areas where we're resolving the flood depth. And so it can be very, very detailed output. And I'll show a little bit of that on the next slide. Or the next 2 slides. So this is just a breakdown of the kinds of metrics that we're producing for that global statistical analysis. Because it's a global product and it's meant to be a high-level overview, we're not trying to produce every single metric we can think of to talk about every single aspect of each of these perils. Instead, we've surveyed our customers and seen what are the things that they are asking us for or asking about. And we've picked, say, a handful of metrics for each of these to try to answer those kinds of questions, I should say. A lot of these focus on extremes. So for instance, wind and precipitation, we're looking at different extreme return periods of, say, daily rainfall or daily maximum wind speed. Flood is the same thing, flood water depths with particular return periods. Heat is days exceeding specific thresholds, or days with dangerous wet bulb temperature, things that our customers have been asking for. I'll also note in the upper right corner, we include upper and lower uncertainty bounds for our metrics for all of these. In fact, we include a full uncertainty distribution. That's actually one of our biggest conflicts with our customers sometimes, is that as scientists, we recognize the value of uncertainty. That's inherent in every projection we make. And we are going to provide that no matter what. A lot of our customers are looking for that one number of, this is my deterministic single value of, this is what my value is going to be in the future. And so it's a lot of education, again, on our part of working with our customers to help them understand how does uncertainty factor into your analysis, and how can you, in many ways, take advantage of that estimate to improve your projection for the future as opposed to just falling back to that one number. So this is an example of what a customer might see when they're looking at one of our products. This is from our planning suite of products. So again, this is down to the meter scale resolution. I think this is a flood depth map, looks like for New York City that we produced in the upper right corner. And looking at the values they selected on the left, this is 2050 combined flood with a high sea level rise scenario. And this is the 1% annual chance of exceeding, and this must be the mean, because they don't have the uncertainty panel up. So this is the kind of modeling that we do for these planning projects. It gets down to, I believe this one was 3-meter resolution over this area. So this is an area of New York City where there's a lot of industrial buildup, and it's a flood map that is looking at storm surge probably is the main threat here. And this is the kind of detail that our customers are looking for. They've got, say an area this size, much smaller than, say, a weather model grid cell, much smaller than a climate model grid cell, and they want to know, is my storage tank area going to be flooded versus my shipping terminal area? So for flooding, this is the big concern. This is a lot of what we do. When we get up to the meteorology, we usually, we're not necessarily looking at variations on the meter scale, but we do, for most of our meteorological projects, we're getting down to the kilometer scale of local variations in climate. All right, so with these products that we have, what are some ongoing research questions that we're working on? So getting back to those metrics, a lot of those metrics, as I mentioned, have to do with extremes and how extremes will change in the future. By far, that's what our customers ask the most about, is how extremes will change. It's kind of sad sometimes because I want to be able to show them plots of here's our expected global mean temperature change, and look at that nice confidence that we've got in that, and all these models agree. It's not as relevant to most of our customers. So trying to figure out how to talk about extremes and think about extremes is an ongoing challenge for us. Some of this comes back to that, again, that spectrum of customers we have. There are a lot of customers who, they've got a risk model that they've got in mind. They can take numerical values. We can give them numbers like the 95th percentile of daily precipitation and how it's expected to increase, which is great if you can plug that into a risk model. It's somewhat difficult to unpack for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience working with weather or climate data or understanding what that really means. There's another class of customers that really, their understanding of climate science has come from what they see in the media. And so that's more of these kind of phenomenological, broader picture statements that we make about things like the frequency of cyclones will decrease or increase in a future climate. A lot of climate science is phrased that way in the types of conclusions that they draw. That's what the media kind of picks up, is on these broad statements, but trying to implement that both in a quantitative way and also rectify what this number means, the change in 95th percentile data precipitation, in the context of something that the customer can understand, like the frequency of these kinds of storms we had last year is going to change. Trying to put together into a cohesive story and explain it to customers is an ongoing challenge for us. All right. Can I make this go away? Okay. Another ongoing question we've got is trying to maintain the scientific rigor while thinking about efficiency. Despite my lauding all the benefits of the cloud and whatnot, it still is pretty darn expensive to run a couple thousand of WRF simulations on the cloud. It's not cheap, but it's probably a little bit more efficient than what we could get buying our own computers and trying to maintain them all the time. So we are always looking for ways to get at the answer that we are trying to get at without doing a whole bunch of other work or a bunch of unnecessary analysis that isn't really relevant to that particular problem. So one example of this is, here we're looking at extreme temperatures in Central Park in New York City. If we're really only interested in the extremes above a certain threshold, maybe we're going to do a dynamical downscaling exercise to try to look at this local variation in climate. So one way of doing that would be, let's just simulate every day of every year from every climate model and have that whole time series out there for us to analyze, which would be great, but there's a large number of days where they're not relevant to the question we're trying to ask, which is how are extreme heat events changing in the future climate. So if we do a little bit of legwork first and look at, say, what are the large-scale environmental conditions that are conducive to extreme heat days in this area, and be a bit conservative in how we define that, we can instead build up a simulation set that we're not simulating all the days, but we are simulating at least all the days that are relevant to the part of the distribution we're interested in. And that lets us do these kinds of analyses, do the full-blown dynamical downscaling, but save a lot of cost on simulating things that we didn't have an intention of simulating before. I think we are, down the road, probably within a few years, going to do a point where we are going to think of more holistically about maybe we just do want to do full-blown dynamical downscaling simulations that we can probe for all these different perils instead of looking one peril at a time. But for the moment, this is our way of operating, and this is something we are constantly thinking about. Another question. What are the best places to devote our attention for methods like machine learning, dynamical downscaling, and statistical methods? We have a whole team in our data science team that looks at machine learning, and they're trying to apply it to specific problems. But what we've been finding is, for a lot of these methods, it can be really hard to beat simple linear regressions or simple empirical models that have been around for years or decades to try to answer these questions. And so, we'll invest some time to look at these new and advanced methods, but we found time and again that probably 80% of the time, it's really hard to beat something that's already existing, already well-established method for doing these sorts of problems. And surprisingly enough, our customers seem to appreciate this, as this seems to be the mantra in Silicon Valley these days is, we're going to use AI machine learning to fix every single problem, pay us money and we'll fix we'll answer all your questions. And there have enough companies that have been burned by that promise, or they come back 2 years later and don't really have any new great insights, that we've actually heard from customers that they appreciate the fact that we're willing to admit that, no, we don't think machine learning is the solution to everything. And we can point to other well-established, well-vetted methods for getting at these problems. I mean, we do think there are applications for these methods, and we're trying to find them, and I'll show some examples of that in a later slide. But, this is an ongoing process for us to figure out where can we apply some of these techniques in the ways that they're going to be most beneficial. Verification and validation at local scales is challenging. Like I implied, particularly for our flood models, we're getting down to meters of scales of grid spacing and resolution. Trying to find the data to validate that, yes, this model is doing exactly what we think about at all billion grid points that we produce for this analysis is really tricky. So we're constantly looking for new ways of using what observational data we've got to validate things at very high spatial resolutions. So here are some examples of, for instance, we're using Landsat thermal imagery, not because we're measuring land surface temperature, which is different from the actual 2-meter air temperature we're trying to model. We first tried looking at those magnitudes and figured that it was really hard to draw a lot of conclusions because they're really measuring different things. So instead we looked at things like the spatial correlation of those maps and do a rolling window of spatial correlation to say, within this neighborhood, am I getting the warmer spots warmer and the cooler spots cooler? And that does give us some information about the spatial variability that we're producing in our analyses, and is it actually consistent with what we see from, say, satellites. We're also looking at crowdsourced observations as another way of kind of augmenting our in situ observing network. I've got some background in this from my PhD work, but a lot of what we've done for crowdsourcing these days is looking at flood events. And there's actually a lot of groups out there who are trying to do this. We work with both insurance companies, local governments, where people will call in and say, I've got flooding going on at this location, let me know. And just that binary yes, no, there is flooding here or not, can really help us narrow down whether or not our flood maps are producing flood in the right place or not. And then finally, and this gets to my the last thing I want to talk about, what is the best way to engage with our academic partners? So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm starting this appointment here as an honorary fellow of this department. And this is also an experiment on Jupiter's part. I've got another colleague who is basically has an equivalent kind of appointment with Stanford University out in California. And Jupiter's grown to a point where we're willing to devote some of my time to working with this department and the students and the faculty here to try to come up with ways we might be able to work together going forward. So what we've been doing so far in our academic engagements, some of these are, I'd say, kind of minor engagements, but they've been fruitful nonetheless. One is an internship program, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, because we've got a lot of grad students in here. I want to explain what that's about. We've done some joint proposals and some funded research projects where we are providing the funding. Typically to this day, they've been very targeted, where there's a clear deliverable of this group has a particular model they're developing or a particular data set that they want to generate that we think is of interest to us. And there's that kind of clear connection of, okay, we can bring that in, we can use it immediately. Let's go ahead and either go in with them on the proposal or provide funding for that. Not so much on the end of more open-ended sorts of research, but we are moving more in that direction to getting at some of these broader questions. We do a lot of letters of endorsement. I don't know how many NSF career proposal letters of endorsement I have submitted for various people of, hey, I think this work you're doing sounds great. And then we participate in community discussions and conferences. So we've got a fairly large presence at AMS meeting this year. We have people going to AGU. And we've convened actually a couple of sessions at these conferences about some specific problems that we are interested in soliciting papers on. More longer term, as I said, we're growing to a point in Jupiter now we can start thinking about longer term multi-year research and development efforts. And that's just in its infancy right now. But we do have Dr. Julie Pullen on our staff has now been named, her title now I think is climate strategist. But one of her goals is to help thinking about these longer term research and development efforts. And so I'm going to be working with her in trying to identify some of those opportunities. And then what can we do with this kind of position that I've got here? I'm planning to spend some of my time in the department hopefully talking to a lot of you, and I'm eager to have these conversations about what we might be able to do. I'm going to wrap up talking about our internship program, because that's probably, I think, the most well-established thing that we've got that we've been doing the last 3 years. I coordinate for 2 of those 3 years, and it's been a lot of fun. So what we do for our internship program, it's been mainly graduate students, so we have had some exceptional senior undergraduate students participate. It's been a 3 or 4 month project, typically over the summer, though with COVID times and people working remotely, we're starting to expand doing these during the academic year. Where the student will come and work with us for that time period. We are sure to get the permission and consent of the academic advisor. We did have one student who wanted to do an internship with us, and then the advisor came back and was like, well, you've got to be spending your time on your thesis, otherwise you're not going to graduate at the end of this. So we had to negotiate that. But we're hoping that not only would be just permission, but also the collaboration of the academic advisor in the project. We'll pick a project that has to be of mutual interest to both Jupiter, but also to the interns. So we don't want to say, like, we've got this task, we're going to make you work on this, and you're not really interested in that topic at all. We really want to build something that's of mutual interest. We provide access to Jupiter's data storage and compute resources. In the past, these have also been paid internships, so there is a paid component to that. You'll be assigned a science mentor at Jupiter, who is kind of your main advisor person and guides you through Jupiter's resources and what we have available, but also get a chance to interact with a lot of the people on our science team. We have a very, as I said, collaborative environment in our company and the science team, and you would interact with a lot of people. The goal is to complete a project arc so you can deliver a presentation to the company at the end of the internship about what you have accomplished. But most of the time, this actually extends beyond the end of the internship. And a number of our interns have gone on to publish the results of this project or incorporate it into their thesis. And some have even gone on to be fully integrated in short order to one of our actual active products that we're doing at Jupiter. And hopefully in the end, you build lasting connections with our science team. So some examples of the projects our interns have worked on. One of the reasons I have the most fun with the intern program is not only for our interns, but also for us on the science team. It gives us a chance to kind of go out and do some projects that we may not otherwise have had the opportunity or freedom to do, just because they're usually a bit outside of our main product development stream. So we get to explore some ideas or methods that we've always wanted to explore, but never really had an opportunity. So here's 2 examples of projects where people were really interested in using more of these machine learning or AI type techniques. This one on the upper left, had a lot of fun working with Brian Gronke in 2019. He used a convolutional neural network method based on super resolution techniques. So this is actually related work that's been published even in the weather and climate sphere. TJ Vandal has a paper on this. The idea is to use super resolution techniques, which is this idea of, say you're given a blurry image, and you can apply this machine learning technique to it, and in a sense, try to sharpen that image. And in many ways, that's similar to what we're trying to do with the downscaling approach, is take this kind of coarse representation of climate and refine it to some local scale variability. And so he built this neural network, convolutional neural network model that would take as an input a coarse, say 1 degree resolution daily precipitation map. Then here's a target of, there's actually a WRF simulation that was downscaled from this dynamically, of the actual daily precipitation with much finer spatial detail. And this model, it wasn't just a deterministic model, it actually produced this marginal distribution we could sample from and produce realizations of finer resolution precipitation maps that would have been, by the model's estimate, consistent with this larger scale precipitation, this coarser precipitation map. So again, recognizing again that uncertainty is important, it was key for us to build into this model this idea that there is no one-to-one mapping of this coarse representation of precipitation at 1 degree resolution is going to absolutely map to one high-resolution map. We wanted to build a model where we could sample from this and get realistic-looking, high-resolution precipitation fields. And it worked out better than we expected, and he actually ended up publishing this in Climate Informatics. Another example of a project that an intern worked on with us was using deep learning and long short-term memory models to predict streamflow time series from large-scale climate predictors. This, again, had been looked at in literature already. It wasn't a new idea. But we were particularly interested in how well these models could predict extremes. So if you look at time series of extreme flow, for instance, as you go over time, there'd be large precipitation events that would give these spikes in stream flow, which are usually associated with flooding, which again is one of our main areas of interest. And it was unclear from these previous papers whether or not, when you look at these time series, these machine learning models were actually able to capture these extremes. They seemed like they were mainly focused on these large-scale, overall time series validation statistics. And so Michelle took a look at that and found that in many cases it actually could predict the extremes reasonably well. Not all these projects have been about machine learning techniques. Abby Smith in 2019 worked on some seasonal forecasting of regional temperature and precipitation extremes. And this was using a statistical model with an analog-based technique. So looking for analogs in historical climate to predict on a seasonal scale how temperature and precipitation extremes would change. She particularly focused on Australia because we had a customer who was interested in that at the time. Another intern, Josh Jacobson, did a statistical model looking at uncertainties in sea level rise. So, often our sea level rise projections are given as kind of this continuous, smooth time series over time. But if you want to look at the sea level rise in a particular year, there's a lot of variation as to what that might be. And so he built this kind of autoregressive time series model to predict synthetic samples of how sea level might actually change over time, superimposed on this large-scale signal to give us a better estimate of the uncertainties in sea level rise. And finally, Josh Jacobson was actually with us for 2 years. He also did a project, this doesn't necessarily have to be a science or climate question we're answering. He actually looked at if we could do some of the analyses we do faster in a different programming language. So right now we primarily use Python with Dask and that whole environment for our programming, our science programming and parallelization. He actually explored transferring some of that code into the Julia language, which is emerging as kind of a way to do this kind of distributed processing on large arrays a little bit more natively and intuitively than, say, using Dask. And found that for some of our analyses, you could make them run 9 times faster using the Julia version of the code versus the Python version. So that's great information for us, and he in turn learned a whole new programming language as a skill out of this internship. So that was fun for him. And I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to leave with this. If you want to reach out to me, my email address is here, and this is the best one to reach me at, luke.madaus@jupiterintel.com. I just got assigned an office up on the 15th floor, so I'm planning to be there. We'll see how things go with COVID restrictions and how much interaction we have, but 1 day a week is what I'm aiming for. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk. And if you not only about project ideas for collaboration, but also if you're interested in the intern program or just what you want to do to make yourself stand out if applying to a private sector job or things like that. I talk about that with a lot of people in academia all the time. I'll also call it our job postings. We're in a period of rapid growth right now. We've got 60 employees right now. We're aiming to have 100 by the end of first quarter of next year. So within the next 4 or 5 months, we're going to be adding a whole lot of people, and there's a lot of open jobs we've got right now. So feel free to take a look. If you're in a position where you're interested, let me know, and I can also give you more detail about any of these jobs if you're interested. And I think that's it. So any questions or comments? Happy to take them.
your fellowship is going to present in our department. I had a question that's kind of maybe an odd one, but you talked about the physical science aspect of what you guys do here, Jupiter does. I was curious, what's the role of social science and not necessarily being a translation layer between what you're doing and what the customers need, but in sort of a co-design of the types of research that you're doing to meet customer needs?
That's a great question, and it's admittedly one that we've viewed through more of a business-oriented lens. So we've got in our product team a whole group of people who are customer solutions architects is the title. But it's interesting because they're not in the traditional sense of what a customer solutions architect is. They're expected to know a fair amount of the science behind the kinds of projects that they're delivering. And they're actually our main interface layer between the science team and our customers. And that is actually an active area where we're trying to figure out how do we take these people from a business community and give them the background and expertise to be able to communicate our science in an effective way. It's an ongoing challenge, for sure, and it's one we're really just starting to get into. In the past, it's been the science team interacting directly with our customers, and we ourselves also were not the best at handling that communication. So I'd say it's an open area for us to try to figure out how to do that better, but that's where it's happening right now.
Okay.
I think we have a question from the YouTube stream. Karen Russ asks, which journals are the main sources of info on machine learning as opposed to, or as applied to climate science?
That's a good question. And I don't know if I have the whole answer to that. I get a lot from the Climate Informatics group, which they've got proceedings and they've got a journal. But a lot of it's been scattered around that I've seen. There's some stuff that pops up in monthly weather review, more of the weather time scale. When we talk about our flood models, like the long short-term memory stuff, those were all in hydrologic journals and applied hydrology journals. I know that the AMS just started a new journal that is specifically devoted to that topic, and so I'm curious to see if that kind of centralizes a lot of these publications on machine learning techniques. But yeah, in my experience, it's been spread out over a lot of different journals that are very niche to the particular domain where they're applying. Other questions? Yeah.
You showed the org chart. I don't really remember it, but is there a role for like marketing or lobbying at all, or is this field just growing so much organically that that's not even needed for business development?
So yeah, we do have, I'll leave this up here, but we do have a marketing group that we do work with. Right now, actually, they're an external consulting group because we're still emerging from our startup phase where we don't want to have necessarily our entire marketing team yet. But they've done a fantastic job. So there is a marketing aspect. And our business development team as well does a lot of outreach to different industry groups to let them know this is what we're doing, this is what we're capable of. And yeah, so we do have that capability. Ankur.
Yeah, thanks, Luke, for presenting. I'm glad to have you here.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to, now that you're taking on a role with some leadership and you might be involved in some of the hiring decisions, in terms of advice to graduate students, what are the kinds of skills and experiences that you would ideally like in people working in your team in climate and weather modeling?
That's a great question. And one thing I'll preface it by saying is it's been very competitive in the last rounds of job postings that we put out. So what we have typically done in the past when we post our job postings is they're intentionally somewhat generic. So like right now we have an advertisement for data scientist, and it's just wide open to data scientists. As a result, that position was open for, I think, 2 weeks, and we got 425 applicants to that position. The first thing you do to stand out is you have domain expertise in atmospheric sciences, and so that already gives you that kind of leg up of, okay, that's something that's great that we're looking for. The next thing you do, though, is trying to separate yourself from your academic background and all the academic work you've done and think about more of what is your skill set and what do you have. So a lot of times what will happen is we'll start having interviews with promising candidates who've got the domain expertise, you've got skills listed on your resume that look like they're applicable. A lot of time in the resume usually is devoted to, this is my thesis work and here's all these things I did in my thesis work, which is great. It's not as relevant to us. When we start talking to you, we'll ask questions about how you think through problems or how do you apply your skills or present you with challenges of how would you approach solving a particular problem. And a lot of people just keep running back to their thesis and be like, well, when I did my thesis, I did this, and I did my thesis, I did that, instead of thinking more abstractly about what are the skills I have and how can I apply them more generically as opposed to outside of the context of my thesis. If there's one thing I would say to graduate students who are applying with us, it's think outside your thesis, and that's not the only thing you should be talking about when interviewing with us. Other than that, yeah, it's about the skill set. So we'll see that you have domain expertise, but being versed in the kinds of programming languages that we're looking at, like we mainly use Python, we use a little bit of R, don't use MATLAB at all. So if you come with us a resume and just say all that you do is MATLAB scripting, that's great, but you're going to have to make up for the fact that we're going to have to spend you time spinning up on our Python background and all of that by saying like, yes, but with this MATLAB, I implemented this kind of statistical analysis model and I was able to quantify uncertainty using these methods and all these sorts of things that show that you can apply the skills more than to make up for the fact that we're going to have to retrain you in our programming methods. So some of it is a little bit of the luck of the draw. We just happen to be using Python. We happen to be using, if you have experience doing stuff on the cloud, that's another big thing that's often a selling point. But if you don't have those skills, it's got to be, you can show us how you could apply these methods in a very clear, succinct way and show that you think about the full scale of these problems and not just about your thesis.
Hey Luke, great talk. I had one particular question that I read somewhere that some of the cities are moving towards being climate resilient cities. So do you have any clients which are, they can be like a government or public sector, who are trying to shift their city to becoming a climate resilient city sort of thing. So it's basically an urban planning point of view to looking at climate change. So do you have any clients who are working on this?
Yeah, in some of our public sector clients, that is one of their ultimate goals. One of the things I'll speak to with respect to that is there is a certain amount of privilege in those clients where there's only certain cities with certain resources and certain capabilities that are really even able to think about making those kinds of changes. And it's been interesting to watch that develop because for those, when you look at the scale of things that these cities have to do to try to adapt to these sorts of changes, it's a lot. And we're in meetings with people from everything from the health community in that city to the people designing the storm sewer systems to all sorts of building engineers and all sorts of people from all over the place. It's a lot of people and a lot of resources to do that. We're providing one small component of that piece, which is maybe how precipitation might change in a future climate, or will you expect more heat waves? But from that little nugget of information, there's a ton of extra work that has to be done. And I personally find it somewhat humbling and somewhat scary just how much time and resources that you have to devote to that, and how many places just do not have the kind of resourcing to handle that. I mean, that's one thing for our small part. Another thing that Julie Poland is doing now is developing a way for cities and local governments that maybe could not afford even to buy our services to still have access to the kind of data and analyses that we are producing. Just in some way of trying to ease that transition and give them one less thing they have to worry about as they're working towards building these solutions. So in our own small way, we are trying to help with that.
You said that your work is very fast-paced. What's your turnaround time from when a customer asks you something, and then does it lead to longer work days or something like that?
So, good questions. I'd say our typical production arc is on the scale of 2 to 3 months for a customer request. So they'll come to us, our product and business development teams will finalize the details of here's what the customer is asking for, and then that's when we kind of press go as a science team and start our analysis pipeline. And yeah, it takes usually 2 to 3 months to go from that to we're delivering flood maps and or delivering maps of heat metrics or things like that. So that's on this kind of customer-based production scale. We then have a longer period development of that larger statistical downscaling global product. And those, a development cycle for that, usually there's a research and development cycle, which is 2-ish months, and then a production cycle where we've got the basic methods down, we just have to scale it up to be global. And that's another 2 to 3 months. So most of our projects could be working on would be 6-month time scale or less. we've been emphatic in the company, in the culture of our company on the science team, we're not going to ask you to work on weekends, we're not going to ask you to work on holidays, and everyone respects that. If we're running late in a project, then our product team agrees with that philosophy, and we'll go to our customer and say, hey, we're needing an extra week to get this together, and so far, we've never had a problem with that. As a result, I think a lot of our employees are fairly highly motivated, and we don't feel, I think, as stressed as you might expect with that kind of time frame. It's a conscious decision on our part. Yeah?
As a company, a private company working on climate risk and working with larger private companies, especially on climate risk, do you do anything with the culture of your company and other companies to change their behaviors to be more green, or is that something you don't touch?
That's a good question. And I'd say that is not something that we actively have been trying to do. We do have, that is something that I should say, there are a number of people on our staff have made, it's an opinion that many people on our staff have made known to our leadership team of, there are some customers whose behaviors that we may find questionable, that we may not necessarily agree with. But what we found is the applications, the customers who are asking us for that, those kinds of customers who are asking for our products, the applications that they're using are still very much things that we want them to be using our data for. It's not like we're going to withhold our services from them or something and try to force them to change their way of being. There may be some companies whose environmental practices we all would kind of agree are not the greatest. But these are the same companies where if they don't know that that storage facility with all those chemicals is going to flood, that's a big problem. And we want to be sure that they know that that storage facility has the potential to flood. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a much worse problem down the road. So, we're conscious of this, and we're definitely going to work with those companies. But we're not trying to actively change it.
I guess in that same vein, are all of your results publicly available, or are they, call it the disclosure of your clients?
So it's a mix of things. So there is a component of our product, particularly that large global statistical data scanning product, that is technically available through the Open Source Climate Initiative. Our location-specific analyses, we tend to not have publicly available, but through like this work that Julie Pullen is now setting up, there will be mechanisms for if people wanted to access that data and can have a reason for not paying for that data, we can definitely make it available pending some negotiation.
All right. Any?
Why would customers go to you instead of going to the private service sector?
Good question. And it's mainly because we have all the staffing and resources to talk with them and educate them on this is what these metrics mean, these are what the uncertainties are, and we can produce analyses that are specific to their needs. That's actually one of the biggest things we hear from our customers is a lot of the publicly available metrics that are out there that are produced aren't specifically relevant to the questions that they're asking or not on the scale that they're asking. So that's one of the main reasons that they come to us.
All right.
Well, I just have one going on what you said. It sounds like you guys are filling a niche in the industry and you're scaling up quickly. So is it you're filling a niche, or is the niche expanding rapidly? And so what does that mean for competition?
It's a good question. I'd say it's more that this niche is growing. And these targeted applications of climate data and climate science are only increasing as more and more customers or potential customers with more and more diverse needs are starting to ask these questions. What we've seen is there's a number of startups that are starting up that are focused specifically on one peril or one idea. In fact, there's a lot of startups that specifically only do flood. That is their thing. Other groups that will only work on, say, agricultural type metrics, and that is their only thing. One of the things we're trying to do at Jupiter is we're trying to provide kind of a more comprehensive solution where we look across all these different perils, and if a customer has needs that span these multiple perils or multiple classes, we can provide them all to them in the same interface with the same company, kind of the same methods, so it's not like we're getting this data from this company and this other data from this other company. That's been kind of our mantra going forward. But I totally expect that you're going to see more startups starting over the next several years. It just seems like they're mostly happening in a very niche, specific I'm going to focus on this one class of outputs or class of predictions going forward.
Cool, thank you.
Mhm.
Why is the company called Jupiter?
Another great question. That's a longer story. Our CEO, Rich Sorkin, started a company many years ago where they were trying to do basically weather predictions on the cloud. There was this idea that there was a lag between when something like the HER would come out. It wasn't the HER at the time, it was more the ramp refresh. And when energy traders would make their demands. You'd have the GFS, and then several hours later you'd have this localized prediction. They built a company to try to run basically the WRF model faster on the cloud to be able to produce a forecast with a small margin of time difference and sell that to energy traders. And he called the company Zeus, because Zeus was what? Greek god of lightning and thunder, and that was supposed to be a weathery thing. At the time, the cloud wasn't really very mature, and they realized the timing, they could technically beat that, but there wasn't a whole lot of interest or added value. Stopped that company. The next time around, when Rich wanted to start thinking about doing a new company in the weather and climate space, they were going to call it Zeus 2.0 because it was his second attempt at doing a weather type company. But then no one liked the name Zeus 2.0 once they said, well, what's the Roman equivalent of Zeus was Jupiter, so that's why it's Jupiter. And that's how we ended up with Jupiter. So, not exactly the most elegant story there, but that's the way it worked.